So, thanks to Sony giving me early access to the PS5's firmware 2.0 beta, I've managed to get stuck into what this offers, and one big important enhancement is that internal SSD slot. But wait, for a job this complicated, only one man is fully qualified. So I jest a little bit. Obviously this firmware offers a lot more than just the SSD, and I will be covering that in a future video. But at the moment I'm just going to discuss the SSD and compare it against external, internal, and even amongst itself. How slow can you go, how fast can you go, and how does it stack up against that internal PS5 SSD? All that and more. So let's go commando. Well, not that kind of commando. So first things first, you'll need one of these, a screwdriver, a heatsink, and an M.2 SSD. And obviously one of these white things here, a PlayStation 5. This Samsung 980 Pro exceeds the requirements. Remember, you need a PCIe 4, so Gen 4 NVMe M.2. This one is 500 gigabytes, but you can obviously choose whatever's on the market, which is the benefit of not having a proprietary solution. This advanced Gene heatsink I bought from Amazon, again, is a perfect fit, cheap, around £12, but you can check out the links below on Amazon. First things first, if you don't need this, then skip straight to the test, but if you do, this is the guide to how to fit it. So pop out these covers on top of the PS5 by holding one hand on one side and then pulling to the left. It's very, very simple. And this gives you easy access to that, till now, redundant SSD slot in the PS5. Unscrew the cover, and that voided space can now be filled with some lovely M.2 NVMe SSD goodness. Take your heatsink. If you buy one that I've not recommended here, then obviously just check it fits first before you attach it, because if you do attach it, then returning is going to be very hard if it doesn't fit. Although you can use ones that don't fit, and I'll discuss that a little later in the video. Once you've done that, make sure you get your SSD that meets minimum requirements, so 5.5 gigabytes per second read speed. Read, not write. The Samsung 980 exceeds that, it's 7 gigabytes per second, so we have no worries there. You get these wipes, and they're important if you've got a very dirty fingers or you've got a dirty SSD, an old one you've taken out somewhere else. Make sure you clean all those contacts on the heatsink itself and the chip itself, otherwise you're not going to get good adhesion with that thermal paste pad that they give you. Take these and attach it on one side to the bottom of the heatsink. Do not remove the top part just yet. I want to make sure that you actually line up the chip, so make sure that the actual retaining hoop is free and it's not covered by the pad at the back or the heatsink itself, and again at the front the connection's got enough space to slide into the slot freely within the PS5. Ensure that all those are in place and lined up properly, and then remove the sleeve and then give it a good solid press down to ensure that the SSD attaches to that thermal paste. You need that to pull heat away from the chip and into the heatsink. And once you've done that, you take the other thermal compound and put it on the top of the SSD itself. Again, give it a good solid press, rub around to make sure that it sticks and nothing is overlapping the edge. And then take the top of the heatsink and click that in. Make sure it's clean, as I said before. Push it in, and on this one it will connect in, and it will also click into place itself, so it will fit in, both being held by the bottom clamp and also by that compound pad that you've put on the top of the chip. And it's vital you get good contact here on the bottom and the top. You want a minimum amount of gaps, air gaps, so it sucks as much heat out of the chip itself and into the heatsink, and then that's pushed away by the actual console itself and the air vent. Make sure everything's clean before you put it back in the drive. You can clean these with an earbud or a cotton wool bud or a Q-tip, as it's called in America, with white spirit and turpentine, and then just clean that up, drop that back into the drive, put the spacer back in and screw it back in, or leave it in place and fit it in that way. Make sure everything lines up first. And again, top tip, do fit a heatsink. Do not, I've seen channels do this, do not put an SSD in your drive that's going to run at these speeds and just leave it without a heatsink. It's going to die quicker. Yes, it won't die straight away. Yes, you'll get performance out of it, but potentially at some point in the very near future it will just go pop, because these get very, very hot, and there's a reason why they come with heatsinks and why you get one on motherboards. Again, that fan circulation of the PS5 sucks the air over and across the top, so make sure you do that. And then just put your cases back on, and again, it's very easy. Just clip it in and push it. I'm doing it here with one arm on my elbow and one hand. It's very simple. That clunk there, that's what you want to hear, and that clucks into place. So So once you've done all that, you now have a SSD installed in your PS5. Now there are other options. Obviously the depth of the PS5 slot limits what you can do, or at least how big the drive can be fitting in, and in terms of length and width there's also limits there as well. But generally you're not going to go wrong with the ones that I've got in the link below, but don't buy something stupid that looks monstrous because it's just not going to fit. But most desktop SSDs will fit. But choice is never a bad thing, and that means we control the market and see what's available. And the Corsair MP600 is a great choice, and it's threefold why I picked this. So one, it's actually below minimum specification, 5 GB per second read rather than 5.5 GB. B, it's actually got a heatsink pre-fitted, so you don't have to faff around with actually connecting one. If you don't want to do that, you can buy this one and drop it straight in and away it goes. And D, it actually is too big for the PS5 slot itself, and that means that it's too deep to fit in. Now this does mean, and I don't recommend this because the requirement is you put the case back on, but I tested this with the case back on all fully assembled for a few days and it never had any problems at all. There's perfect airflow over it and the heatsink, but you can just put this in, leave the case off, put the case back on the side, leave the cover off, sorry, put the case back on and then use it and it works fine. So if you don't want to swap the drive, don't bother, just put it straight in. It works perfectly, it connects fine, and it fits in, and it gets a nice, beautiful airflow, and temperatures are still pretty good, and I tested those on both of these as well, just to give that additional element of this hardware test. So now we've got two drives that we can use to test out. Let's jump into it. Now before we do, I just want to touch on one thing, which is Gen 3 drives don't work. So I did try the Sabrent drive, it doesn't work. You can see it here connecting, installed it in, turned it on, and it tells me that it's too slow. Gen 4 is required. So Gen 4 is a bare minimum. So once we've got this installed, we can test those drives. So let's jump into copying files to see kind of limited bandwidth we get. Remember, this is testing write speed more than anything else. But here with the 980 Pro versus the internal SSD of the PS5, what we can see is we copy rift apart over to the 980 Pro and back again to the internal SSD. We can do it in 28.4 seconds on the 980 Pro and over 2.5 minutes on back to the internal SSD. So why are we getting upwards of 5 times in terms of speed difference between the two? Well, as I covered before in my previous video, again, do go and check that out. I'm not going to dwell on that video. There's much more information in there I did a few months back. Essentially, the internal SSD has been limited by API, the overhead of the operating system. It's limiting the data there, so it's obviously controlling it. On top of that, it's more likely using a cache to write the data to, validate the data, and then write it to the drive to minimize or maximize lifespan and minimize overuse. And almost certainly, it's a much slower write speed drive. It doesn't need it. It's not a PC, it's a console. And that's why we're seeing such a significant increase in performance and throughput. 5.6 times the throughput, 1.3 gigabytes versus 230 megabytes. And even the MP600 is the same, 1.2 gigabytes. So that's 5.3 times the throughput of that internal drive. So write speed is the limitation here. Obviously, this is all based on sequential reads and sequential writes, though in games, that's the most important thing, storing it. And that's one of the benefits of SSDs, because there's no spin-up time, there's no latency to get to the data. It's almost instantaneous compared to older drives, but you can see the limitations here on the write-back speed. And in fact, if we look at the wider collection of titles across the entire board in terms of how many games copied back and forth between them, we can see that the 980 comes out on top on everything. It's got the highest bandwidth, the highest speed. The MP600 does a good job, and it's certainly much closer when it comes to PS4 titles. You can see here, using an external M.2, which was fast before, copying that back, you're getting on a PS5 game 132 megabytes over to the M.2. And if you've got a PS4 game, you're getting 380 megabytes. Even that is faster than the internal drive, as I covered in my previous videos. So let's look at those PS5 loading times. What do they look like? Well, PS5 titles will obviously be much quicker than anything else, therefore the delta may look bigger in terms of percentage, but in terms of time it's very small. And Resident Evil 8 gives us a good example of what that actually looks like. So Resident Evil 8 is a very, very fast multi-platform title that utilizes the newer architecture of these new consoles, and it can load the game in 2.1 seconds on a 980 Pro, which gives us our biggest delta between the 980, 28.5%, but it still is almost 2.5 times faster than the internal Series X drive. And even then it's only 0.4 of a second slower than the internal PS5 drive, so it really is no slouch. That is the worst case scenario I saw. Every other title was nigh on within 4 or 5% single digit deltas between the fastest of the 980 Pro. And in fact, even using that loading to the dash from the card using Demon Souls, so starting the game off and then using a resume state to go back to the title, the PS internal drive was actually faster, 30.2 seconds, and it was 31.8 for the 980 and 32.2. But this game, like many games, has a lot of online sync connection with servers, so that slows it down, and that might be nothing to do with the drive at all. But when you actually load the title straight from the dash, or at least jump between different worlds, then you get 9.1 seconds on the internal, 9 seconds on the 980 Pro, 9.3. So you're not going to notice that delta, but obviously you get much cheaper options in terms of drives, and you can boost that performance for less than £100. You can pick up this 500GB model of the MP600 and get almost exactly the same speed as you're getting from the 980 Pro, and often the same or even faster than what you get from the internal drive. Sackboy, Miles Morales, Rift Apart, they're all pretty much identical between them. And Rift Apart is one that is heavily testing the title, and that brings us to the performance of it. So if we take all three drives, we get the game installed and we play a section that really utilises that heavy streaming of that SSD, that I/O infrastructure. Is it causing bottlenecks on the system? So straight away we can see identical dips at the same place on all three drives here. On this section, as we stream through the world, very linear, but it is streaming data in and out. We can instantly see that the MP600 is ever so slightly faster than both the 980 and the PS5 internal drive. And that continues for a few seconds more into the title, but we get a few more dips and it can flip-flop between them. And actually the 980 takes the heaviest dip at that point and drops below. Look at the average at the bottom. But we can see very similar stutters, very similar patterns, slightly longer or prolonged sections on the PS5 at the longest point. So we get 2 sections of 50 milliseconds where we get a spike on the other two drives up to 50, back down to 33 and then 16. So it's a slightly different presentation of how that stutter is appearing. But overall, when we end this little 1 minute section, we are pretty much identical between all three drives. So what does that tell us? Well, two things. Insomniac themselves have said they're not maxing out the throughput of the system. We're probably seeing somewhere, like I rumoured at the time of covering the title, a couple of gigabytes per second here. So it's not maxing out the MP600, and probably the issues here have got nothing to do with the throughput of the drive. It's got nothing to do with the queues and everything else. It's not at the maximum level of the drive. It's very, very early days for all these titles, so we're not at the point where all this data is being streamed as quick as possible. So at the moment, and probably for the next 12 months, you'll probably perfectly fine to buy something like the MP600 and possibly even slightly slower drives if you can find it. In the terms of PlayStation 5 titles, as we sit in the current environment and software, there is no concerns here in terms of speed. There's arguably points where it can be slightly slower, but you're really not going to notice it outside of this kind of comparison. Playing multiple PlayStation 5 titles like Demon Souls, like Sackboy, like Returnal here with Celine running around at a frantic pace and jumping between biomes, there is absolutely no cause for concern, and I really don't see that significantly changing in the future. Now there are some subjects and some caveats to that, which I'll get to in a moment, but let's move into the next test, which is how good is it for PlayStation 4 titles. So a perfect PC title throughout the last year has been Cyberpunk 2077. Some may say that CD Projekt Red needed the next generation versions just to run it on the last gen consoles, but here we can test the loading speeds, and what we see is almost identical results. The 980 Pro is fastest at 33.3, very close behind, 0.3% is the internal drive at 33.4, and then less than 1.2%, or just about 1.2% slower, is the MP600 at 33.7. Even the external NVMe drive, that Sabrent drive I mentioned earlier, and I tested vigorously in my last video, so do check that out, even that's only 37.8 seconds. So overall, 13.1% slower. We're seeing obviously much longer times with an external 5400, but even that's only 48.6 seconds. And again, these are all backed up with a Deus Ex Mankind Divided test. All of them are identical, proving that it's most likely a limit on the CPU utilization and actually just getting data in the engine rather than any bandwidth or SSD limit. That's certainly not in the way. All of them identical at 24.3. The external drive is a little slower at 26.2, and then the 5400 is slightly slower than that at 29.4. So it's not being held back massively by bandwidth here and read speed. So again, your mileage will vary based on the games, but overall there's not a huge reason to utilize all that expensive SSD space when you can just use a cheaper external SSD, a SATA 600, plug it into the USB 3.1 and use that for all your PS4 titles. You're not really going to notice a vast amount of difference, certainly in loading and certainly not in performance. PS4 titles and PS5 titles, there is absolutely no concern here. It all runs perfectly. So let's get into that final part about heat. So as I mentioned at the start, heat sinks are important. These are very heat sensitive. In fact, electronics generally are very heat sensitive. So you need to keep them cool. And what we saw here is putting the MP600 and giving it the test, it actually exceeds the limitation on the box. So the box says it's 4.9 gigabytes per second. But as you can see here, I was getting 5.5 gigabytes in the internal PS5 test when it does the format and test the bandwidth. I'm getting around 6.6 gigabytes per second on the 980 Pro. But when I stress the drives out and put them through their heat test, you can see the graph on screen of the high points that they got to. And this is, again, using a sensor attached to the heatsink itself. So I'm getting a sensor on the heatsink. You can probably add around 15 to 20 degrees Celsius on top of that in terms of the internal chip inside. It may even be even more. But overall, it's hitting at a high point of around 44 Celsius. Both of them get very, very close to each other. But when I instantly quit the game, or went back to the dashboard, formatted the drive, and then literally tried to test it again, I lost almost 1.2 gigabytes per second on bandwidth on the 980 Pro, and that's with a heatsink. So that's what I'm saying about utilizing these without heat sinks and not giving it good airflow and good. This is what you're going to get. You're going to get reduction in performance. And again, bringing us back to the test that I mentioned and the overall caveats, everything has to be designed around the slowest point. So developers will probably not max out any of these drives for the foreseeable future, and they still need to work with the slowest factor. That means you'll still get issues where you get an overheating drive that's going to play up. Games could start having issues, so they still need to have that level of tolerance in there in terms of the drives that they're using. So remember, this is a beta. This is early pre-launch code that's not available to the public yet. So a lot of these things here may change. They're still tweaking it and taking feedback. I'm sending them information from my tests as well. So they definitely will be improving this going forward, and it should be out sometime after summer for everyone to start sticking their drives in themselves. But overall, the early views are very, very good. And as you can see here, looking at the overall percentages between the drives, the difference is negligible. If we take the internal drive as 100%, then the 980 Pro is 1.1% faster and the MP600 is 3% slower. You would never notice that. And the big difference here is you can choose across the market. These are all 500 gigabyte drives, but you can easily pick up, of course I've just got a new one out now, you can pick up a brand spanking new 1 terabyte Gen 4 SSD M.2, it'll fit inside the PS5, it's £109. That's almost half the price of the equivalent space you can get on the Series X consoles with their proprietary solution, and that's all you're stuck with. Now, this is again the wins and losses. Xbox did the right thing. They got something out quickly at the start, and that worked in their favour back then. But now the consumer's going to pay off because we can choose what drive to buy, and the prices are just going to keep decreasing. Nothing will decrease on the Series X side unless they get other partners in and they compete amongst themselves to give you the best value. Just like you saw with third-party peripherals many, many years ago on consoles such as controllers, memory cards and all that kind of good stuff. So overall, it's the best thing here. Sony got burnt with their Vita solution, so maybe they've learnt from that, and that's exactly why they've done it. But it is benefit for us, the consumer, because we get to choose. And that means that in terms of pound per performance, you're getting much better performance at the same amount of space for much less money. And that is what every consumer dreams of, right? Anyway, as always, I hope you guys and girls enjoyed this deep dive into the new PS5 2.0 beta. There is more to discuss on this, and there'll be a short video coming up very soon this week that will cover more on what the beta actually offers. And if you do like what I do, remember I am completely self-funded and independent, so I really do appreciate and need your support. Any pounds or dollars you can give on Patreon really help me improve my quality. Obviously, like, subscribe, share, and comment down below to help that YouTube algorithm that's always bearing over our little heads. I hope this helped take a load off your mind on what to do when those SSD options open up to the public. Oh, I know, sorry, I'm out. I'll catch you on the next one.